Secondary school number 17. Ordinary classrooms, ordinary children. But what was happening behind its walls was a horror hidden from the eyes of most. In March 2015, 26 students disappeared. The police said there was a breakdown in the ventilation system. The case was closed. But one student survived. His name is Danil. He was the last one to see the truth hidden behind the mask of an ordinary school. Danil sat in the shadows, his face barely visible. He spoke calmly, but there was an inexplicable fear in his voice that could not be just a nightmare he had lived through. "We thought everything was as usual," he began, his voice shaking. "Every day, the same bell, the same lessons. We didn't know that behind the walls, something terrible was happening." The children never suspected that they were part of an experiment. The school was not just an educational institution, it was a laboratory hidden behind a false mask of ordinariness. Behind the mirrored walls that looked like ordinary scenery, their behavior was analyzed and recorded. Every step they took, every word they said. But when the gas appeared, everything changed. The gas was not just a chemical substance. It was an experiment that was supposed to take the students beyond the limits of human perception. It did not just cause suffocation. It made them see terrible visions, hidden fears. It tormented the mind, making the children lose control of themselves. Danil told how he tried to hide from everything that was happening. He found a corner in the classroom where he could hide, and he felt something terrible covering him. A terrible sound rushed through the corridors of the school building, from which the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. He tried to find a way out, but the doors did not open, and the walls seemed to shift, creating a labyrinth. The teachers, they did not save the children, they just watched. One of them whispered, "This one survived. Look how he twitches." Those who couldn't breathe disappeared, but the survivors were part of something bigger, something they couldn't fully comprehend. When Danil woke up, he was home, but it wasn't his home anymore. Everything had changed. The mirrors began to distort his reflection, turning his face into something alien. Time seemed to be tied to this nightmare, and with each passing day, he lost touch with reality more and more. He began to hear footsteps, even though he was alone. He felt that someone was watching him. His surrounding reality became more and more unreal. He saw the empty eyes of other children in his dreams, heard their voices, but they couldn't help him. He was alone. And when he returned to school, he realized that at some point, this place ceased to be what he knew. Everything became unreal. But the scariest thing was that he felt like this something was watching him as if it was now a part of him. He tried to tell people, but everyone thought that he had just gone through terrible stress. Meanwhile, new students were disappearing at school. Their disappearances were hushed up, but behind each disappearance were the same hands, the same teachers, the same experiments. The school was demolished, but its shadow remained. The archives were destroyed, and all traces of it were erased. However, those who survived will not forget what happened in this place. They will not forget how something watched them, how everything around was a lie. The final question: are you sure that your school is just a school? A lot of time has passed since Danil survived. He continued to live, but the shadow of what he experienced did not let go of him. It seemed that he was torn from the reality in which he knew that everything should be normal. Time passed, but the internal feeling of constant pressure did not disappear. He returned home after all these events, but there was no peace at home. His mother looked at him with a worried expression. She tried to support him, but everything Danil saw was distorted. Everything that once seemed normal now became alien, and his own life became alien. The mirrors in the house seemed unnaturally dark, the shadows in the hallways too long. Danil began to hear voices. It was strange because he was alone in his room, but he heard them, whispers, as if someone was standing behind him, but did not show their face. The eyes he saw in his dreams now haunted him in reality. They looked at him, not blinking, not moving, just watching him try to understand what was happening. Danil tried again to figure out what had happened at school. He returned to those corridors, to those classrooms that were now closed to everyone. The school seemed to have been abandoned for a long time, but he knew that it was still part of something much bigger than just a building. He felt it himself. When he reached the former schoolyard, his heart began to beat faster. The school stood empty and silent, its windows dark eye sockets. All that remained of the school walls could not hide the dark atmosphere that always hung here. Everything was not as he remembered. This place was alive, but as if it was experiencing its last moment. And then, before his eyes, something opened up that made him catch his breath. Walking past the destroyed classrooms, Daniel noticed an old photograph. It was a group of students, but among them he saw something strange. Himself, only at a different age. It was a photograph taken in the year when 26 students disappeared. He saw himself, but something was wrong with this photograph. He was there, but his eyes were empty. Daniil began to feel like a stranger in his own body. The walls around him began to move. He heard footsteps, but when he turned around, no one was there. His heart was pounding in his chest and the air became heavy, as if he was suffocating. The shadows on the walls began to distort, and soon he realized that the walls were starting to fill with those same empty eyes he had seen in his dreams. These were the faces of those who had disappeared, those who had gone through this horror. They were now part of something bigger, part of the school itself, part of something that could no longer be destroyed. He ran, not understanding what was happening to him. In that moment, he realized that everything that was happening was not just an accident. All these experiments, all these disappearances, everything that was happening within the school walls was part of something much darker and older than they could imagine. No one understood what had really happened in that school. Neither the police nor the parents. Daniil realized that he himself was not just a random victim of this horror. He had been chosen. He was part of a plan that he could not understand. Everything had been calculated. This experiment was not finished. It was just one of the stages, part of something that was beyond comprehension. He searched for answers, but all his attempts only drove him deeper into this nightmare. He could not get out. He could not find what he was looking for. All his searches led to new mysteries that were impossible to solve. The more he tried to understand, the more he was drawn into this labyrinth. But the most terrible thing was that he realized he was no longer who he had been before. He was different. He had become part of this shadow, part of this school, part of this experiment. He had seen those who had gone through this, and now he knew that they could no longer be ordinary people. They had become part of something that never went away, a part of something that was watching him, that was observing him. Eventually, he realized that this school wasn't just a school. It was a place where the line between reality and nightmare was blurred. And if he couldn't find the answers, he would be a part of it forever. He had become a part of an experiment, and maybe he was now a part of something much more sinister than he could ever imagine. So now his question wasn't just a question for himself, but for anyone who would dare return to this place. Daniil stood in the dark corridor, his breathing heavy, his vision clouded with fear and despair. The shadows on the walls continued to move, and his thoughts were indistinct. He tried to understand what was happening, but the more he thought, the more he felt that reality around him was becoming more and more shaky. Every movement, every sound became suspicious. He began to feel like something invisible was watching him, as if from inside this place. He saw children in his dreams who were no longer there, their empty eyes following him, haunting him at every step. These children did not disappear. They became part of this place, and now they were part of his own life. He tried to find a way out, but no matter how he ran through these empty corridors, the walls seemed to shrink, locking him inside. He remembered those strange moments when the doors did not open, when they became walls. This place was not just a building. It was something alive, something that could change everything around, making people forget or, conversely, see too much. His thoughts began to shift, as if he stood on the edge between two worlds. And that's when he understood. Those who disappeared did not just disappear. They did not leave forever. They became part of this evil, part of what was always hidden. But the worst thing was that they began to come back. Daniil saw them, alive, dead, or maybe just existing in this in-between state. And the worst thing was that they were trying to remind him of themselves. He heard footsteps. They were unclear, but they were moving in his direction. He turned around, expecting to see someone, but there was only an empty corridor in front of him. However, the footsteps continued without stopping. The shadows began to move, as if following him. He felt his heart beat faster, but his body could not move. He froze, unable to understand what was happening. And then he heard a whisper. It was a familiar voice, but he couldn't quite place it. He felt his own name being spoken in the darkness, and his face was beginning to distort in the mirror that hung on the wall. He walked towards it, losing touch with reality with every step. His reflection in the mirror was no longer his. He saw empty eyes and heard a voice he couldn't make out. "You won't be able to leave here, Daniel," the voice whispered, as if from the mirror itself. His reflection smiled, but it wasn't his smile. It wasn't his reality. Daniil staggered back. He realized that his life had long been part of this evil. Everything that was happening to him was not an accident. He had been chosen to continue this experiment, to become part of what was happening at school. And now he began to understand that his search for answers would not lead to completion. Everything he saw was not an accident. The school was just a tool, just a backdrop for something more ancient and terrible. He realized there was no way out. Everything was cyclical, and those who had disappeared were now back, and he was the last. Suddenly a figure appeared in front of him. He couldn't make it out. It was like smoke, like a shadow. Her face was covered by a hood, but he could feel her looking at him, and that look was not human. It was something that could not be part of the ordinary world. "You are not alone, Daniil," the figure said. He tried to say something, but his words could not escape his chest. Fear paralyzed him. He was trapped, and he could not get out. He was no longer himself. "You will be with us forever. You have become a part of us," the figure repeated, and its voice was like an echo. "You were chosen, and you are not alone. All these children, all who disappeared, they are all here. They are all with us." And at that moment, Daniil realized that everything he had experienced was not just a nightmare. He was part of something that went on forever, and now he couldn't leave. He couldn't go back to his old life. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, the school seemed to be empty, but in fact, behind its walls, in the shadows, in these dark corridors, everything was going on. School had never been just a school. It was a trap. Daniil stood in front of the empty corridor, his consciousness increasingly losing its clarity. Inside him, there was a feeling as if the very air around him was becoming more and more viscous, as if he was plunging into something inhuman. He tried to figure out what was happening, but the more he thought, the harder it became to understand where reality ended and the nightmare began. The figure in front of him, covered in shadow, took a step forward. Daniil felt his heart squeeze. Fear gripped him, but at the same time there was a strange itch of curiosity, as if he were part of something much more important than his own life. And this feeling did not leave him. "You understand everything, don't you?" The voice was low and enveloping. He felt the words seeping into his consciousness, making his heart beat faster. "You have become a part of us. We are all here even if you don't see it. We are watching all the time. Who are you? What do you want from me?" Daniil could barely speak. His voice sounded alien, as if he was talking not to himself, but to someone else entirely. "We are the ones who were chosen," the figure said. "The ones who were part of the experiment, part of the school, part of something much older. You, like us, are now forever here." Daniil cringed in fear, but then he realized something important. This experiment, this school, it was something more. He was trapped, and not just him, but all the other students. Those who disappeared did not just disappear. They became part of this dark force, part of what now existed beyond the school. Suddenly, everything around him froze. Everything became foggy, as if his body was beginning to disappear. He could not move. His consciousness was slowly consumed by a feeling of helplessness. He began to see other faces, empty, expressionless, their eyes looking at him with the same horror he felt. And in that moment, he realized that they were all here, with him. All these children, they were part of this nightmare, part of this place. But what was even scarier, he began to realize that now he too had become part of this eternal cycle. Everyone who had ever been in this building were now like his shadows, like something that lived in his memory. We are waiting for you," the figure said, and its voice echoed in Daniil's head. He felt how this cold penetrated every cell of his body. "We are all waiting for you. You will not be able to leave anymore." Danil did not know what to do. He tried to run again, but his legs did not obey him. He increasingly felt how something invisible and strong was pulling him back, to where there would be no escape. He remembered the last moments when he managed to survive, how he hid, how he fought for air, how he hoped for salvation. But now it was clear. He was trapped, and there was only one way out: to become a part of something that could not disappear. The school no longer existed, at least in the form in which he knew it before. Now it was something alive, something sinister, with something deeply hidden behind its walls. And everyone who entered these walls became a part of this world. He realized that what was happening to him was just a part of a huge machine that continued to work even after all the witnesses had disappeared. He saw how the children he knew, how the teachers he remembered, were now turning into shadows, in the voices that came from the dark corners. Danil was no longer one of them. He was already a part of something bigger, something that could not be stopped, something that continued to move despite everything that was happening around. And at that moment, when he realized this, he felt how his consciousness began to be absorbed by what was around. Time ceased to exist. He became a part of the school. He became a part of the evil that had come here long ago and never left. Now that it was done, that everyone was gone, Danil understood. He was a part of this place, and this school was still watching. It was still watching everyone who had ever been within its walls. The mirrors in this school reflected over and over again what was happening within its walls. And perhaps everyone who dared to return would already be watched by those eyes that never died. Danil, consumed by this nightmare, stood in the center of a dark corridor where time and space were distorted, and all his attempts to escape were futile. He knew that he was not the only one. Those who had disappeared, those who had become a part of this place, were now everywhere. They were no longer people. They had become a shadow, a part of the misty evil that continued to exist beyond the walls of this school. He looked at his reflection in another mirror. His face was familiar, but his eyes were empty, alien, as if they no longer belonged to him. A silhouette appeared in the reflection. It was not him. It was someone else, the one who waited here before. "You will return, Danil. You will always be with us," the voice said, and it was familiar, cold, sounding from different corners of space, as if the world itself was whispering around him. Danil felt the fog around him thickening, the walls shrinking. He saw his own shadow begin to move independently of him, as if it existed in this world on its own. Suddenly the door at the end of the corridor opened. The shadows parted, giving him a path, but something about this path did not give him peace. He stepped forward and felt something invisible wrap itself around him. It was not just a feeling of fear. It was a feeling of being pulled back into the very essence of this place. As he took a step through the open door, he heard a familiar voice. "Did you think we would let you go?" The voice sounded, and for a moment he recognized it. It was the same voice he heard in his dreams. He turned around, but there was no one. Everything around him began to blur into fog, and in that same second he realized that he was not alone. The door he found himself behind was not just a door, it was a trap. And when he tried to step back, he noticed how those he once knew began to disappear behind the door. But there was no return. The school was not just a building, it was part of something alive. And now Danil understood. He had not just become a part of this school. He was now a part of the shadow itself, which would watch those who dared to enter. And when he turned back to the door, there was no one behind it, only darkness. "Now you are here forever," the shadow whispered, and everything was swallowed by the darkness.